Good morning to all y'all viewers of the Dr. Ober Tashaka show, to Carnita Groves, who's coming in from Ghana, from the U.S. that lives in Ghana now. JB, who says, smile, it's healthy. Okay, that'll get a smile from me. Brother Ogawa, peace, brother. How you doing? Um, we have in store for you again something special. I don't know if you, like I, enjoyed the last two shows that we had on trauma and also on addiction of all kinds, but focusing on drug addiction and alcoholism. Sister Robin, how you doing? So we have something special for you today. I'm always trying to get into some other areas. As I do on all these shows, I want to encourage people that are coming on that haven't subscribed to subscribe. And I want to encourage you to encourage people to watch the show. We're getting close to 2,000 subscribers, and this has been a lot of work. This is our second year. We've gone a year and a month, and we're going into our second month of the second year. As I do on every show, I want to encourage people to subscribe to the sixfold stages to mental freedom. I think that we could show in the last show how that applies to dealing with addiction issues. And while there's some special things that people who have been addicted to drugs or alcohol or other forms of addiction have to go through, that I'm not claiming the sixfold stages to mental freedom addresses directly. The ultimate thing is, in all of this, you saw both of the presenters stressing the fact that love is the ultimate issue. Self-love, which is a key thing that is the basis for your wholeness, your identity, your happiness. If you're going to get any love in life, it starts with love of self, and it's unconditional love, accepting yourself the way you are and working on yourself. So that we saw in the two shows how some sisters and brothers could get pulled off their path through addiction based on trauma that occurs in the family. And so we saw the analysis on that. People who have been abused and stuff like that. Those are things that really set them up for that. And the worst kind of abuse is not receiving any love at all. That is rare, but it is occurring more now because of the infusion of a large amount of drugs and then a drug culture into the Black community that's competing with ours. Ours have went out. And in fact, just about everybody that recovers and gets off of drugs or alcohol, it's some component of their culture, usually family, some form of love that pulls them out. So sixfold stages to mental freedom is focusing centrally on the development of self-love. And we saw in the last show how even sisters and brothers who come out of families that do a pretty good job of showing love and encouraging self-love, external forces can pull people out. The observation was made for Blacks coming up in the mid-60s that it wasn't just the intrusion of a large number of drugs into the Black community at that point, but it was the whole hippie culture that some people, particularly those in San Francisco living in the Fillmore, could get exposed to, because the Haight-Ashbury, where the hippies were, was close. And so, and then it being associated with socializing, partying, things that young people like at a time in which people weren't fully aware of how addictive these drugs could be, could pull someone in. But usually when you looked at that, that person was also vulnerable because of um, certain weaknesses within themselves. Even though they had got a lot of self-love, they had certain things going. As one of the people said, um, certain things that they saw their family putting up with in terms of relationships. You know, to keep a man, you let him do a lot of things that disrespect you. And the last show, playing around a lot. And so those susceptibilities that had been bred into the family could also open you up to disrespect that in turn could, you know, brew over to the point that you got so frustrated and everything else, drugs might be one of the things you go to. So it's not just what you didn't get in the family, it's that the external forces. And we know with drugs coming to the Black community in the 80s, those external forces were extremely powerful as they are today. So then that takes powerful forces to counteract that. And sixfold stages to mental freedom, the whole efforts that we make when we're pulling our communities together give us forces that can give us support. So this these last two shows were very instructive and I thought extremely good. And I'm really proud of both those ladies, what they've done with their lives and in helping Black people. And one of the things that Gloria Young Thomas, my former student, in the last show stressed is that one of the things that is a big contributor to addiction, and we were focusing on drugs and alcohol, but there's a lot of other addictions as well, is low self-esteem. And in the case of Gloria Young Thomas, she focused on an area of low self-esteem that she described as self-hatred that was special in terms of how she was influenced by drugs and alcohol. And it was, I get from what she said, an internalized belief that she, like a lot of our people have, and a lot of people have, that she was not deserving of the best treatment, that she had some doubts about herself. And when the cup ran it over, the mistreatment in the family, which it appeared was a lot of it was playing around, that she had seen in a lot of relationships, including in her own family, that opened her up to going over what she called the line. And getting into some serious addiction and drug abuse. What's interesting about both of these ladies is, given the time that most people who are alcoholics and drug addicts are, theirs was relatively short, 4 or 5 years, which is, you say, a lot of time, but a lot of people who are into addictions, it can be 30 years, 40 years. It can be a long struggle. And part of that is attributable to the strength of their families and what the families had instilled in them, and the relationships of each of these ladies to their mothers that they had great respect for and love for. So those help pull them out. So one of the things that you got from both these ladies, and I think from what we know generally, is self-love requires that you don't let anyone disrespect you. Self-love leads those of us who love ourselves not to allow others to step into our happiness. You hear me? And put us in the misery zone. Now, in life, there's going to be some. I'm not saying you just drop somebody because they're not making you happy for the moment, because happiness is internal. Nobody really makes you happy. You know, it comes from within. But if you're in an environment of misery and you call that a relationship, there's something wrong, because that's not normal for a loving relationship. And that's what you seek. And of course, to get love, you got to be lovable, you know? And so that can also, when we're not loving ourselves, can lead us to put out the vibes that draw in just what we don't need. And often think in the beginning we don't have, because in the romantic stage, everything looks good, you know, until you wake up. So those two discussions I thought were extremely valuable. It went well beyond just addiction and addictive behavior, but into deep issues about what do we feel and think about ourselves. So today, you know, preparing for this show is kind of like jazz, and so I have to get the feeling. And I was working out. It took me a while to get this feeling, so I finally came up with this topic. And so, as you saw, those of you that received the promotional on this show, um, the topic for today's show is African and African American philosophy, the basis for Black consumer cooperative economic development. Let me repeat that. African and African American philosophy, the basis for Black consumer cooperative economic development. In other words, I'm going to be tying together the culture with economic development. And some people may think, oh, you just go into a business and that's it. No, how people approach anything's a reflection of their culture. And economic development is one of the biggest reflections of culture. For example, if we're looking at the European, the pervading system of economic development for them and now for the world is capitalism, and it's expression of culture. Capitalism can't really be delinked from patriarchy, and that patriarchy is a system where the male is dominant and dictates in the family. Not in all families in reality, but that's the model for their families. And that plays over into how their political systems work. A few people run and control it for their benefit, not caring too much about the welfare of anybody else, contrary to popular opinion. Well, he's talking about white people privilege over and above us, but compared to the system, they're just getting more crumbs than we get. And now they're getting close to our crumbs, and that's part of what's driving the right wing. So capitalism is really an expression of their economic culture that grows out of their family systems and their overall culture. And it is something that is bringing misery to the planet. Now, don't get me wrong. Now, let me show you a little contradiction here. John Henry Clark, but I've said the same thing, but I'll quote him. John Henry Clark was both a nationalist and a socialist. I don't describe myself as a socialist, but I understand what he's saying. But he was into African ideas about economic organization. And he wasn't a capitalist. But John said this, to prosper, for us to do anything, you need some capital. So how do you develop some capital without becoming a capitalist? Well, that's not too hard. Well, it is hard under oppression, but it's not too hard. It doesn't have to be contradictory as long as you ain't exploiting anybody. But the key point is this philosophy of capitalism, and it gives rise to a economic system of capitalism. So when I'm talking about African philosophy and it's linked to economic development, it's got a whole lot to do with it. How you think is going to determine what you do. And your philosophy reflects your deepest thoughts. So that's what we're going to be dealing with today, you know. And why? Because our community is in bad shape in a lot of ways. And one of which is our people are living in abject poverty. Too many of our people, too many living on $20 an hour, you know, doing good to make 20,000, 25,000 a year if they're working. And that's due to the way in which the people that run the economy have set things up. And a sector of our youth, a significant sector of our youth, are in real trouble because they are often frozen into these low-paying jobs. And a lot of our older people too, but especially younger people, especially if they don't have a high school degree or don't have a skill. And even when they do, they find themselves locked into a lot of these low-paying jobs. So addressing this issue of economic development, there are two levels. One would be jobs and the other is economic development. I'm focusing today on economic development, and it's very important, but the linkage of economic development to culture and to the deepest part, which is our philosophy. Now, we have a number of great scholars, and one of the great ones is a brother named Harold Cruse. For those of you who have read Harold Cruse, on your chat, put I have or something like that. Let me see how many people have read it. He wrote a couple of books, the most important of which was The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And this book was a classic, and classics are very rare books. And I'll explain why it was a classic in a minute. But on page 327 of The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, he makes an observation that's very important if we're going to understand why we're in a lot of the crisis we're in, and why we aren't doing as well as we could do economically. It's not the whole reason, because we're up under oppression, which I call semi-colonial. It has aspects of colonialism and systemic racism. We're up under that with vestiges of slavery, and now what I call a choice between two cultures, things that I've gone into before. So we're up under an oppressive system. But to get out from under oppression, then there are a lot of things that we have to do. And on page 327, Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, Harold Cruse points out one of the big roadblocks to Black liberation. Now, it's not the sole one. And not everyone in this group that I'm going to describe shares these characteristics, but the majority do. And so this is his comment. He says, taken as a whole, the Black bourgeoisie, here he's referring to the Black middle class, usually Blacks who have received a college education, some haven't, but usually those that have and have gone through what they call this higher realm of education. Some of them have done well enough economically to be a part of this without having to have a college education, athletes, business people, some entertainers. But for the most part, the Black bourgeoisie is a part of a class of people also called the Black middle class. Now, bourgeoisie can also mean people who run and control an economy. And that's generally how you would describe some of those who run the capitalist system, for example. But generally, it's referring to this middle class group. So he says, taken as a whole, the Black bourgeoisie in the United States is the most politically backward of all colored bourgeoisie classes in the non-Western world. Now, this is pretty serious, because he's saying more backward than in Africa, more backward than in the Caribbean, more backward than anywhere else we are in the world. And it is a class, he says, that accepts the philosophy of whites, whether radical, liberal, progressive, or conservative, without alteration or dissent, and calls it leadership. Clarence Thomas would be an example of someone who has taken on the extreme of right-wing thought. Some people have called him a conservative. He's actually to the extreme right of the Supreme Court. He's not a conservative, extreme right, which means that he has a great amount of contempt for himself and his people. And so he's an example of that. And then you have blacks who are in the bourgeoisie who are radical, who take on, say, the philosophies of Marxism or something else without applying it to their own culture. Ho Chi Minh can call from Vietnam, who led the liberation struggle in Vietnam, a Marxist, but he was a nationalist first. He embraced Marxism because he agreed with Lenin, who was the leader in the Russian Revolution that took over for a period of time after the fall of the Kerensky government, which was an attempt at some kind of, I don't know what, democracy or whatever. And he had formulated the idea that in colonies where people of color are oppressed, then what you needed was a united front for liberation. So in the colonies, he said that the various groupings of people, in Vietnam, it would have been Buddhists, some Catholics, farmers, various sectors of the people needed to have a front, a united front, to fight the colonizers, to fight the French, the Japanese, and then the Americans. So Ho Chi Minh embraced Marxism because he agreed with what Lenin said. He wasn't following Lenin. And by the way, Ho Chi Minh was inspired by Marcus Garvey, who said Africa for the Africans, Asia for the Asian, and Europe for the European. And I pointed this out before. He was working on a French steamship line. They stopped in New York. He went to a Garvey meeting. He heard that. And then he said, I started to think, what am I doing here working for the French? I need to go back and help liberate my people from the French. And that's what he told Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, before, when he went to Vietnam, told him to get his black ass and go to Africa and aid in the liberation of Africa. But it took a black man to prick his consciousness, so I think he was already pretty well awake. But he could take on a form of Marxism that suited his nationalism. His nationalism guided that. So he came from the intellectual class. He was a Confucian scholar. He was, and that's not a bad thing, because the Confucian system has got a high emphasis on ethics. When he died, you could put all his possessions in a duffel bag. He refused to live in the palace of the French when he took over North Vietnam. He lived in the servants' quarters. He was a humble man and wise and smart. They called him Uncle Ho. So he brought in his own creative ideas, and he could say under the rubric of Marxism. But here's the deal. Ho Chi Minh aligned with the Russians because he said he needed one white power to fight another one. In other words, he needed the rockets, the missiles, and the weaponry that came from the Russians to shoot down the planes that came from the French, or that came from the Americans or the Japanese, and to shoot them. You understand? But he thought for himself. He had his own ideas. And the first thing he thought was the love of his people. That was the first thing. So blacks in this country have had trouble with that, because usually when they tried to even marry Marxism with nationalism, the Marxism played the leading role in this and took them off into some funny directions. But there was some interesting efforts to synthesize the two among some. They came out of the group called the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM, for example, in the 60s. They produced some pretty brilliant people, but I don't think they got much out of Marxism. I really don't, you know? This point he's making, that the black bourgeoisie in the United States is one of the most politically backward of the colored bourgeoisies in the non-Western world. He's not only including Africans, because it accepts the philosophy of whites, whether radicals. So in this particular case, without alteration. And that's because of an alienation from their own people and their own culture. And then the same thing with the liberal, the black liberal, who ends up becoming more Democrat than the Democrats, you know? I could think of a number, and some of them good people, most of them probably, but no sense of originality. John Lewis would fall into this category, and I think that he's a good man. I respect him, but he's frozen in 1965. He didn't go beyond 65. He didn't go where King went, you know, around the human rights challenge and everything else. His heroes became Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. He had a lot of respect for King, but he didn't undergo the growth that King underwent. Part of the reason is he didn't do his homework. You know what I mean? He didn't do his homework. And so he was a liberal, and liberalism is itself a funny doctrine. You know, I was watching Bill Maher. He was on CNN, and he was complaining, you know, the good old white liberal, who's saying, I don't know why I get criticized by, he's implying blacks. I'm on their side. Really? He said he didn't support reparations. He said the reason was he didn't do it. That boy's worth $140 million. I checked out his bank account. You know what I mean? $140 million. You mean you ain't willing to give up a penny of that? And do you realize you got it, you know, through free labor without that as a comic, which I think it's obscene that, and he's pretty good comic, you know what I mean? It's better than most of the political thinkers in the white world, better, but he's still a liberal. You know what I mean? The liberals got a problem. And so he's going to tell us he's on our side, but we're telling him, really? You know what I mean? Really? Huh? Meaning you're on our side as long as we side with you. That ain't how it works. So liberal, too many blacks who are coming out of this black bourgeoisie can proclaim their liberalness, which is better than a conservative, you could say, but in the end, they're constricted and limited or progressive. So his first point is, you know, this black bourgeoisie takes on the philosophies of others without alteration, without even thinking about it. And then he goes on to make this observation. Referring to the black bourgeoisie, he said it is a class that absorbs very little from the few thinkers it has produced. Martin R. Delaney, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, E. Franklin Fraser, Carter G. Woodson, men who left something behind them. Now, there are many more than that list. I'm not going to go through the list. There's many more, men and women. But his point is that we produce some creative intellectuals. This black bourgeoisie, in large part, doesn't even look at their thoughts, doesn't draw an iota from them. So he goes on to say, it is the one non-white bourgeoisie class in the world that fears to express its own legitimate nationalism, waiting on the benevolent nod from the power structure before it moves to achieve its limited social aims, because it refuses to be assertive about its Afro-American heritage. This class fails to be revolutionary on any social front in the United States, not even in civil rights, and often fails to even be progressive or even be liberal. And too often it's talking loud and saying nothing, or can talk some real heavy talk when things get heavy from the grassroots, and the grassroots starts to move. So they'll make a lot of talk, but there's no walk behind the talk. And that's the group called the Black establishment. That's a whole nother discussion. It's a control group of major Black institutions, major Black leaders that work in alignment with the whites who rule this country to keep us under containment. So this is a serious charge, that the bankruptcy of the large part of the Black bourgeoisie is its failure to shape a philosophy that is grounded in its best thought. And its best thought would come out of the deepest thought of its people that express a love for themselves and an urge and desire for its liberation. And so it fails to touch on that because it doesn't want to offend old master. You hear me? But I would go further. I would say that it's not only that the Black bourgeoisie has failed to address its best thinkers in the US, I would say that it has also failed to draw from the best thinking of our African heritage. It's failed to draw from the best thinking of the philosophy of Africa, the political systems of Africa, the social systems of Africa, the economic systems, and the spiritual systems, and generally the culture of Africa. And so it finds itself in an amnesiac position where the only thing that it's good at quoting is white people. And it's not even good at that because it's very often not giving much thought to it. It's behaving like most whites who are in power, being pragmatic and doing whatever you can to make some money, because that's basically what this group is concerned about. So why is it that I would start this discussion on Black consumer cooperatives and the tie of African and African-American philosophy to its development with a discussion of the Black bourgeoisie? And in this case, it's bankruptcy, ideologically. And you could say the same thing for most of the Black bourgeoisie in Africa. Most of it's bankrupt, and for the same reasons. It's turned its back on its own best thinkers, its own culture, in favor of power, in favor of materialism, and again end up, as some writers have said, and was referring to the chiefs of Africa or kings, where after colonialism, too many, instead of being mouthpieces of the people, became mouthpieces of the colonizer. But as I pointed out in previous shows, when they did that, the people rose up against them over and over again. So this isn't just a problem for us, it's a problem throughout the African world with the coming of colonialism and slavery. So why start this discussion off focusing on the Black bourgeoisie? Primary reason, I'm going to give you an example. This was the Mexican Revolution, because this is global and worldwide. Emiliano Zapata, you can't see it, but I have a framed picture of him right behind my computer. He's one of my favorite revolutionaries. It's a revolutionary that led the Mexican Revolution, the turn of the century. Came from southern Mexico. Grandmother was African, but he had flowing through his veins Indian blood and Spanish blood, African blood. He was dark complexioned, by the way, but when they photograph him, they lighten him up. Emiliano Zapata. There's a point in the Mexican Revolution where they capture Mexico City, him and a guy named Pancho Villa. And that meant victory. And there's some pictures of them sitting down and talking. Pancho Villa had been, petty criminal before the revolution, but had become a great revolutionary of the North, and Zapata of the South. And Zapata had a great vision. I won't go into it now because it'll be central to this discussion. I'll bring it up again then. But they're sitting under this tree and they're talking, and then they leave Mexico City. Why? Why I'm talking about the bourgeoisie. In the case of Zapata, he had a vision for running Mexico, but he didn't really have the understanding of how to do it or the skill set, though I think that had he been surrounded by the right people, he could have done okay. He was just learning to read and write, and that's okay for people, let's say, who are in a oral culture. They can run a society based on that, but if you're in a written culture, then you're going to have to also be able to do that. But my key point is they left Mexico City because they didn't have a full appreciation of what it took to run the country of Mexico. They had some vision that was better than the people who came after them, who were corrupt and elite. The key point, the reason I'm stressing this backwardness of the bourgeoisie, and it's not all of the bourgeoisie, there's a section of it that is conscious and aware, and we're going to talk about them. And that's where the salvation comes from. The reason I'm focusing on this is that it generally, not generally, throughout the world, it requires that people with a certain skill set exist so that, one, they can play a role in the liberation movement that too often is a leading role, and two, they can run the apparatus which in, Africa or Asia or Latin America or anywhere else is called the nation state. They're the ones with the skills for that. Now, I pointed out in the case of Julius Nyerere, he could have done pretty well with just farmers around him. If his elite had no confidence in the people and were out to really undermine his agrarian revolution, that could have worked up to a point. He'd have to do some training and stuff, but they had the basic understanding of what it took to build up an agrarian economy. So my point is that if people are going to go forward in the world, they need leadership that expresses their interests, leadership that has some skills for them to develop. You're seeing that in places like China right now, So when you have a largely backward Black bourgeoisie, then it sets Black people back. However, there's a sector within that group that is conscious and awake. If you look at the Cuban Revolution, for example, there's a sector, that represented, the group that seized power under Castro. Or if you're looking at Guinea-Bissau under Amilcar Cabral, or if you're looking at Tanzania under Nyerere. But you need enough people under them so that they can really carry that thing forward, which means that they have the interests of their people at heart. So I want to stress being ingrained in the people's culture and philosophy is central for that. And having a love and respect for the people is central for that. So this is the real problem that we have to deal with. And in order to have a conscious Black middle class and a conscious people, we have to draw from both streams, the creative thinkers and artists and various groups of people that we have created that we need to learn from, and at the same time, the source of that, which is our great African past. We have to marry those two. And if we're standing on either leg alone, we'll be in trouble. But in the case of the black bourgeoisie that Harold Cruse is talking about, they weren't standing on either leg. You know, they were out on cloud nine, high on materialism, another form of addiction, and imitating white people, another form of addiction, what I call whiteitis. Between 1984 and 1986, I chaired the Black Studies Department at San Francisco State University, something I didn't want to do, by the way. I definitely didn't want to do it because I'm administration is like breathing for me. It's easy, and organizing is. But I was there to teach and organize in the community, write, move around the country, and speak. But I did not have an interest in chairing the department, and for a lot of other reasons. It's one of the worst positions you can have. It has a lot of responsibility and no authority. It's a sure stress producer. I learned how to get past that. Most chairs end up with high blood pressure. They end up with diabetes. They end up with bleeding ulcers. I'm describing people here. I didn't. I figured out how to handle that position because one of the big causes of stress is being in a situation that's out of control. And so when you have a job that has a lot of responsibility and no authority, then you're dependent on people around you for everything that happens almost. And that can't be good. But I figured out how to get around that. And so I didn't end up with having that stressful situation. Generally, I have a type A personality, but that alone won't save you. You got to learn how to take those stressful things and work through them and not bring them home and not affect your sleep and all of that kind of stuff. So in 84, and by the way, 84 was the most stressful year of my life. That's when I started going through the transformations around the feminine side of me. So there was a bunch of things that hit me all at once, you know. But nevertheless, Professor Ray Richardson, who was co-owner of Marcus Bookstore with her husband, Julian Richardson, who was one of the two people that got me out to state, was a beautiful lady. She called me and said, Black Studies been good to you? You got to chair the department. And I said, oh, shit. So I took it on. I didn't want to, but it turned out to be a good experience, but it wasn't something that I wanted to do. And when I became chair, I said, I'm not going to do like a lot of others have done, shift the discipline based on what my skill set is. I need to find out where the department needs to go. And that's because as an organizer, I'm situational. And that, I learned that in CORE. CORE and SNCC organizers were situational. We let the situation give us some direction. We didn't come in with predetermined ideas of where things should go. And at the age of 82, I try and keep that open-mindedness. And that's kind of what happens with jazz. You know, you're creating on the situation. And so I let the situation that was going on around the country, the situation in our community, inform me on where I thought the department should go. And so in 1990, we had a retreat in South San Francisco with Dr. Wade Nobles, Dr. Lawford Goddard, Dr. Philip McGee, who was dean of the college, and other faculty members. And we had no agenda. It's the only retreat that I've ever done without an agenda, because the point was for us to brainstorm on where the discipline should go. Now, we're in the midst of an Afrocentric cultural renaissance. Dr. Wade Nobles and myself were both playing leading roles in different ways. I was leading the African-centered educational movement in the National Black United Front, getting this into public schools, and got Wade in, Dr. Nobles in as the chief curriculum developer of an African-centered project at McClymonds High School. That was a battle in and of itself. We had a local group called Buffer, Black United Front for Educational Reform, co-chaired by myself and Mr. Oscar Wright, sister from the Nation Islam, because I like collective leadership. Mr. Wright, still alive, 97, a multimillionaire, come out of Mississippi. Beautiful brother. And by the way, a Leo, 2 Leos. And so we rocked and rolled, and we got this as a national project. And so I'm looking at the discipline, and I know that we've got to change, but I'm not clear about where it needs to be. So we go on this retreat. And in the retreat, Dr. Lawford Goddard, who was Wade Noble's partner, they were both graduates of Stanford University. He's a sociologist. He made the defining statement, and on that, we pivoted and shifted the discipline and took us to another level. Dr. Goddard said this. He said, as a discipline, we're not interdisciplinary. He said, we're multidimensional. And when he said that, then I knew I had a coat rack to put my hat on. I said, ho, ho, that was it. And so what did he mean? He meant that the discipline of Black Studies, as it was set up by Dr. Nathan Hare and set up around the country, offered courses in different areas, family studies, economic development, political courses, psychology, sociology, history, a host of different areas, interdisciplinary, social science and humanities orientation. But we had reached a point where our best scholars could be defined by the multidimensional nature of their scholarship. But Dr. Wade Nobles wasn't just into psychology. He was into spirituality. I watch him. He's reading stuff on Malcolm X, new stuff, and a host of things. And he doesn't any longer call himself a psychologist. Multifaceted. Goddard was the same way. I'm the same way. We bring in Obenga later, same way. And so what he was saying is that based on how nature is organized, everything's interrelated. Or as I said in Dogon philosophy, and anything is everything. And so our best scholars were multifaceted because the realities that face our people, the oppression that face our people, come from many sides. But nature is multidimensional. And so once he said that, I knew then what the discipline, the specific part of the discipline would be, that the system of African thought would pivot around, and that would be African philosophy. Now, I'm an African philosopher, historian, political scientist, and got some other stuff. But I didn't do this because it was my specialty. I did it because based on where the community was at, where the discipline was moving, that's what was needed for the advancement of the discipline. And I got Dr. Nobles and a brother named James Todd and Lawford Goddard to agree that we would hang this discipline centrally on African philosophy, with history and everything else following. This is the only department in the country that centered its discipline on African philosophy, the only one. Now, why? African philosophy is a multidimensional system of thought that ties everything together, all components of the discipline together. And by resting the discipline on African philosophy, we were freeing it from what I call chocolate studies. that is black on the outside and white on the inside. In other words, you're offering everything in the liberal arts that's being offered in white studies. And you're talking about a black contribution, but you have not necessarily altered the worldview of that, the perspective of that, the roots of that, the deepest thought of that. And so African philosophy provided this all-embracing framework for the discipline. In part, the reason why we centered the discipline on African philosophy is you're getting into the deepest parts of African thought, of African consciousness. That's what African philosophy represents. Both African and African American, by the way. I want to make that point. It wasn't just African, it was both. Now, the most important decision we made, and it started with me on this one because I know that the heart and soul of African philosophy, and those of you who have looked at the series that we did on the spirit of God within, the Ka, the Ba, the Kabit. We really didn't talk about the Kabit, but that's the shadow, soul, the heart, mind, all of this. This is the stuff of African philosophy. And African philosophy is what? And that's the same thing with African American deep thought. What's it based on centrally? Spirit. European deep thought is just, an analysis of different things. It's despiritualized. That's the Platonic heritage. But in resting the discipline on spirit, we were resting it on the central principle of African and African American culture. That is the central principle. What do you hear Black people say almost all the time? The spirit told me. I can be sitting in the sauna at the Y, somebody saying, the spirit told me. I'm getting my feet done, And the sister next to me says, baby, the spirit told me this today. You know what I mean? Huh? We're spirit grounded and spirit wired. You hear me? So in resting the discipline on African philosophy, we were resting it on spirit, which is that source that lies within all human beings, but is the grounding of African and African American culture, that is a guide for us in our life. It's an inspiration, and often it's a directional force. So this was key. And then by resting the discipline on spirit, we were able to bring in science, physics, chemistry, biology, into the social sciences, which is prohibited on the university campus because you have domains of disciplines. And if you are in the humanities, this can be white humanities or Black, and you're bringing in science, real science, you'll be blocked because you are duplicating those departments that teach chemistry, biology, physics, or whatever. And that's exactly what happened. They came after us and, wanted to stop those courses. But because we were resting the discipline on spirit, that saved us. And I mentioned this in a previous show. We had a consultation with the head of the chemistry department who wanted to block our courses on science. And these were based on a Kemetic or Egyptian framework. And I had in the room myself and a guy named Dr. Venerable. Venerable had a PhD in chemistry from the University of Chicago. As the ranking of colleges go, that gets high ranking. San Francisco State chemistry department didn't have anybody with a degree from the University of Chicago or Harvard or anywhere else. I don't think those universities mean 2 cents, but it means a lot to them. And so I introduced the chair of chemistry to Grant Venerable, blah, blah, blah. But we weren't going to win with Grant because he's teaching what they teach. And if that's what is the case, they're going to be able to say we're duplicating them. But I told the guy, I mentioned this in the previous show, I said, I usually don't let my opponents know how I'm going to whip them, but I'm going to tell you how I'm going to whip you. See me? I'm in here. I'm not a scientist. So what am I doing in here? I'm chairing the department, but I don't need to be in here normally, but I need to be in here. You know why? We're going to beat you by simply explaining that we're not duplicating you. We are teaching introductions to chemistry, to biology, to botany, to physics on the basis of them being spirit sciences. And you've already heard the show that I did on rescuing the planet from ecocide, using George Washington Carver as the model for the master of spirit science. I don't know if people really see how important that is, because the planet is on the verge of ecocide, of extinction. That is for human life and for all life forms, basically, because of the mad philosophy of Western science, which is a despiritualized, control nature science. It's not, I'm not against science. Garvey said, the race who masters science and technology will rule the world. White people use science to rule the world. We need science, not just, we're not out to rule the world. We just want to free ourselves from the rulers of the world, which means you need it. But the point is not the philosophy of science. And so, I told them, we're going to whip you because I know you don't call chemistry a spirit science. And the person who innovated chemistry came through a dream. You know what I mean? And so he left. And when he's leaving, before he left, he said, I'm going to oppose you, but I admit that all the breakthroughs in science come from the intuitive realm, the spirit realm. So I told Grant Venerable, I said, I bet you he hasn't innovated anything. I bet you the spirit hasn't visited him. And we laughed and we beat him. And so shifting the discipline to spirit as a central component enabled us to transcend even our discipline. We were not doing serious laboratory science, but we were introducing students to science. And those that had the gift or the will, they could go in and major in that, double major, Black studies, and which became later Africana studies, and science, if that's your calling. But even if it isn't, this is important for you to understand and to know. So this was real key. It's another reason why the shift of the discipline, where we made spirit or African philosophy central, was so important. It made the discipline shift radical. Now, of course, a lot of us won't see that because we're afraid of the spirit. We've been despiritualized. A lot of our intellectuals were good at collecting facts and information and data. But when it comes to spirit, that's something that we think should be put in the closet. And that's true of a lot of our African-centered thinkers, not all, but too many. But in embracing African philosophy as the lead for the discipline of what becomes Africana studies, it made this discipline shift radical because we were departing from the despiritualized approach to the curriculum, where spirit is taken out of everything. And this is the key thing that put us in a driver's seat where we could really produce change with our students, because it enabled us to do a better job of touching the spirit of our students. But by taking it out of the despiritualized zone, we were able to then link into the students we're teaching both the mental, the spiritual, and the physical, because that is really the basis for this discipline shift. It drove that. As Malcolm said, When you're undergoing a transformation, the first thing that changes is your philosophy, then your attitude, then your thought, then your communication, and then your behavior. Spirit is key to all of that. And by the way, Malcolm's awakening was both spiritual and political. So this was central to this discipline shift. It was radical, but it was also radical because we were challenging the paradigm for the discipline itself, a despiritualized paradigm. It wasn't just that we're giving people information on African history and culture and African American history and culture, which is important, but we were shifting what was behind that. And so that was key. Up inside a university system based on the despiritualized thought, largely, though not altogether, of Plato. So this was key to it. Now, as we were making this shift, the full weight of the strongest right-wing institution in the country, the Hoover Institution, came down on our heads, Stanford University. And this shift was going on between 1990 and 1992. The Hoover Institution is the most powerful of the think tanks in the United States. When Reagan came into office, the Hoover Institution laid out 80% of Ronald Reagan's agenda. This is the book, The United States in the 1980s, that laid out the agenda shift written by the Hoover Institution for Ronald Reagan. What he did was bring poverty back to America nonstop. What he did was take 81% of the housing budget of the federal government and knocked it out so that low and moderate income housing couldn't be built anymore. When you're seeing homeless people now, it's largely a product of that. What he did was introduce neoliberalism, which is this idea that big business should take just about everything that the government does that could benefit the people and put it in its own pocket. And if the Republicans get both houses of Congress and the White House, they will move to privatize under neoliberalism the last little piece that people in this country have, which is Social Security. And if you look at Bill Clinton, he carried out that agenda as a New Democrat and wiped out welfare, except for 5 years, and without hardly a squeak coming from Black people, which is a shame. You hear me? It is a shame. So this group came down on our heads at the same time that the California State University system willed our destruction. And the president at San Francisco State carried it out. And so for my rule is when I'm doing anything in organizing, I don't let anything take me off my course. But for one semester, I had to stop the discipline shift to rally the community. I'm an organizer, and we got over 150 community organizations, churches, community organizations, labor organizations. They all come and support us because basically a lot of us led different movements that saved our community. San Francisco Freedom Movement busted open the jobs for Black people, a host of other things. Wade Nobles has a Black Family Life Institute that was serving the Black community, a whole bunch of stuff that our community was doing. So when we called on them, they came and gave us their support. And I also knew that the president of San Francisco State had certain ambitions beyond being president. And I knew pretty much how to really disrupt those ambitions if he pulled the plug on us. And so, but it was a 2-year fight. This was the roughest, toughest battle that we had in Black studies, rougher than the strike. The strike took 8 months. I walked the strike every day. The students led it. It was a great victory. But this took 2 years. This was a rough, tough battle. Because not only was the Hoover Institute orchestrating it And think tanks around the country were trying to wipe out African-centered studies, but there was an attack on African-centered departments around the country. Leonard Jeffries' department was attacked at the same time, and his was destroyed because he didn't know how to organize properly. Plus, it was a difficult theater, New York. It was a difficult theater to win in. And then Molefi Asante, who had put together the first African-centered PhD program, he was removed as chair for a while on false charges. Later, they put him back, but that was after a little while. And then they went after the Center for Inner City Studies, where Dr. Jacob Carruthers, one of our leading scholars, taught, a brother named Dr. Anderson Thompson, that a lot of people don't know about, and where Dr. Conrad Worrell, who was national chair of the National Black United Front, I was national vice chair, was thankful for them. He was there because he knew how to fight. And so in the case of the Center for Inner City Studies and the case of the Department of Black Studies that later became the Department of Africana Studies, we were successful in beating this back. The key point I'm making is in doing the discipline shift, we were also fighting to make Blacks who had become middle-class Blacks more grounded, more relevant, and not a part of this group that had turned their back on their own people, their own history, culture, and philosophy. Well, we're going deep to do that. And I should say, we had the only revolutionary department in the country. You know what I mean? It wasn't just Black or African, it was revolutionary. So this was important. Now, one of the key reasons that we could make this shift is that we had a team of scholars that didn't come out of this group of people that had turned their back on their own culture. These were cutting-edge scholars. Dr. Wade Nobles is a part of a team of scholars shifting the discipline in Black psychology. Lawford Goddard, was a brother named James Todd. It was a host of people we had, and then we later bring in Obenga after this discipline shift had happened, who represented some of the best in our scholarship. And at the same time, we're doing things in the community. This was a key thing. These were both of the things that this scholarship that was not imitative was doing. And that's the key point about this Black bourgeoisie. It has wings, and there's a progressive and radical wing to it. It's small, but it doesn't take much. As Malcolm said, on a stick of dynamite, it's the fuse that's the smallest part. Light it, everything else explodes, you know? And that's been proven all over the world. It doesn't take a majority in this group to produce any change. If it did, we'd be in a world of trouble. It just takes a certain number, we don't know what it is, to side with the people in their interests. Now, at the same time, we're doing this discipline transformation, centering it on African philosophy. We, at the same time, were going through a period in which Black communities were undergoing transformation. And this was 1990. So this had been 20 years, 22 years into a shift that I call a choice between two cultures. And as a result, due to the way in which Black communities had been attacked, our people, especially our youth, were being put in a new situation. And that situation was one where families were being disrupted, extended family communities were being disrupted, Blacks were losing good paying manufacturing jobs that disrupted families. I've talked about this before. And so the thrust that we were putting forward was providing some direction so people could have the opportunity to make the right cultural choices. And at that time, as I pointed out with Gloria and Brianna last week, Black studies departments were like also havens and places of refuge from the violence that a lot of young people were facing. And then, of course, the other negative forces that were hitting our community. So we were providing some light and some direction at a time in which it needed it, at a time in which things were not the same as they were when the department was set up. So this required this kind of discipline shift and discipline transformation so that people could have an understanding of what the best choices were when we're faced with a choice between two cultures. Now, one of the things that was interesting when we threw the community at the president, after a meeting where a huge number of community organizations met with him, told him, take your hands off of Black Studies, this was before our victory, the head of the ILWU, International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, he wasn't the head, but he was one of the heads, a Black brother. As they were leaving the meeting, he said, this African-centered studies is important. Don't touch it. In other words, the community saw the value of this discipline shift. Our students did too, because we had nearly 1,000 of them in assemblies where we asked them what did they think, what did they want, and they gave us their ideas, and it was a part of this discipline shift. So while the Black bourgeoisie has proven to be bankrupt largely, one of the ways in which we did a shift in terms of mentality was through either radicalizing a discipline, Blackenizing it, and Afrocentrizing it so that we could counter that and see that we have people coming out who have a sense of self-knowledge, self-respect, and self-love, and who are willing to make a political commitment to their people. One of our mandates, and they got this from just about everybody in the department, was we would say one thing to students. We'd say that you've got to take what you've learned and use it to benefit your community. And I would usually raise the question, what are you going to do with this to help your people? Get them to think about it. And I know our other faculty was doing the same thing. So this was a counter to that. And of course, the Black liberation movements were counter to that. The various movements for social change, that's what woke my eyes up. You know, it was a counter to that because I was a part of this assimilated group, didn't know my history and didn't know my culture. And it's my people who woke me up. Black Panther Party, various other groups, SNCC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and various other, the Deacons for Self-Defense, a host of other groups. They were playing a radicalizing role for some. How radical depended upon how serious you were in learning from the struggle. I was listening to an interview with Dick Gregory, who was on one of the shows that comes out of Howard University. And he was being asked, what do you think about King? And one of the most important observations he made, it was very insightful. And I know Dick was out here in Oakland, and we did a couple of things, Dick Gregory, for the people who had died in Jonestown. We'd come out and we'd speak at the cemetery where a lot of people are buried. And I was impressed with how much Dick remembered about the San Francisco Freedom Movement, because he and I were arrested together. And he put millions of dollars of his money into the movement. So he was being asked about King, and he made this comment. He said, King learned from his movement experience. That was the key thing. And he had become radicalized by it because he followed the truth. He wasn't in there for the publicity. He wasn't in there for money. He was in there for the cause. And he was a reluctant leader. He didn't choose to be a leader. The people picked him, you know? So these movements produced transformation. Black Studies was just one of the culminations of it. Without the Black Freedom Movement, Black Power Movement, Black Panther Movement, no Black Studies Movement, you know? So the six-fold stages to mental freedom is like the key to unlocking that. And that was the key to my awakening. So African Americans and Africans have a social and cultural philosophy. And it's key that we draw from that in terms of building power for our people. The key thing about the United States is it's a nation of nations under the control of Anglo-Saxon Protestants who run the country, you know. And so all whites who come from whether Eastern Europe or Western Europe, whether French, German, or whatever, they got to learn how to speak English. They may hold on to Catholicism, but it's mainly the Anglo-Saxon Protestant view that is going to dominate them. And in the case of other ethnic groups, they also make up groupings that we can call nations. And within the United States, the African American is a nation within a nation. We're not a nation state, but we're a nation within a nation. One of the key things about Harold Cruse's writings that made it a classic was that he identified two streams in Black political struggle. One was integration, the other was Black nationalism. And for the integration stream, he particularly identified Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King. For the nationalist stream, he identified Martin R. Delaney, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X. Now that revelation was one of the things that made that book a classic, because he's right, there are these two streams. But it's really more complicated than he thought it was, because I've never seen Cruse do an analysis of the nationalism of the masses. He did an analysis of the nationalism, particularly expressed through the arts movement, and the nationalism coming out of some of our leading thinkers like Delaney or Douglass and others, or Malcolm. But he didn't look at the nationalism that comes out of the grassroots. And this is what a lot of us have missed. In other words, a Martin R. Delaney, a Marcus Garvey, a Malcolm X at one point, because he shifts later, you could call them nation state nationalists. That is, they wanted Blacks to form a nation state. Nation are a people with a common culture. But a state is where you have a government. You usually have some kind of head, whatever you call them. You usually have a series of things, and a state usually is able to protect itself, usually some kind of military, some kind of police. Often an oppressive state to protect the leaders of the nation against their own people. But the point is, that wing that he described would be described as nation-state nationalists. And he's right, we have a wing of integrationists, and that is the wing he's describing when he talks about the bankrupt Black bourgeoisie. But what about the masses of Black folks? The majority of Blacks in this country, not all, but a majority, forged out of enslavement, created a culture, African-based with new elements, and the intrusion of the slave mentalities into it, but largely standing on fundamental African principles with new ones added. And those African principles are the principles of spirit, the principles of humanism, the principles of democracy, the principles of communalism, and many others. And the new additions, race consciousness, Pan-Africanism. This is my specialty. I spend as much time on my people as I do Africa. In fact, more. Because this is where I live. These are my folks. Africa is mine too. I love Africa, love African people. But our people here, special for me, as they are for all people all over the world, whatever group you come from. So the African and enslavement creates a culture and an art form, and this is the basis for us seeing ourselves as a nation. Africans and enslavement would describe those who did not embrace their culture as no nation blacks. They had various other terms for them, but no nation. And saw themselves as making up a nation within a nation. And the primary basis for this nationality is, of course, the color of our skin, but it's whether you identify with it, and that's our culture. And the principles that drive African American or New African culture are fundamentally the same as those that drive African culture. And the two that I'm going to focus on in a minute are spirit and humanism, two fundamental principles. And notice when the sisters were talking about what got them off of alcoholism, spirit and family, and the expectation that they had of themselves of being good people and knowing that they had departed from that humanism. You hear me? So in talking about the link between the philosophy and economic development, the philosophy and culture, it's to understand that that philosophy is the deepest expression of the culture, both African and African American. So the contradiction in Cruse's analysis of the nationalism was that while he's correct in identifying nation-state nationalism and integration, he doesn't really provide an analysis of grassroots nationalism. And what I would call this nationalism is a nationalism centered on our people. We don't have the land, to base the analysis or identification with, even though some of us will identify with Africa as the place we should go. And if we choose to do that, that's right. That's good. And there's some of us who would identify with land in the South. We'd like to have a nation in the South. If you can pull that off, good, that's fine. But the reality is, for the majority of our people, their nationalism is based on their identification with their people and with their culture. And so they don't see where it's possible for them to go to Africa. A lot of them don't want to, but there are periods of time where a lot did, And very few see how we're going to seize us some states in the South. Maybe that will happen in the future. But the majority of Black people are very practical and smart. And they're not going to make moves unless they can see daylight at the end of the tunnel, where they can see how it's going to work, that it can happen. And so we identify around our people, around our culture. So if you take a Martin Luther King, for example, he's listed by Cruse as being a part of the assimilated integrated group, that is the camp of integration. And there's some reason for saying that, because King would often talk about integration. By the end of his life, he said it was like a burning house, and that he wasn't any longer going to encourage Black people to do that. But the reality is, King came out of a Black family, a Black community, a Black church, and Black culture. Most of his advisors were Black. He had a few whites, but most of his advisors were Black, the people who helped him shape speeches, who he bounced ideas off of. He had a guy named Stanley Levison, who was a Marxist who worked with Ella Baker. who was somebody who he got some ideas from, but his principal advisors were Black. This was a point that Manu Ampin made when we were talking about the radical Martin Luther King. So he was a reflection of Black culture, now Black middle class culture. And he wasn't one of those bankrupt Blacks who had abandoned his people. He loved his people, you know. He wasn't as deep of an intellectual when it came to history and stuff as Malcolm was. But he was better read than people think. And what you have noted with Manu Ampin's analysis of him, he had a close connection to Africa. He was at the independence ceremonies of Kwame Nkrumah, Azikiwe. He was constantly in correspondence with liberation movement leaders and supported armed struggles, including Vietnam. Because he saw, this was Manu Ampin's point, he saw that in those places it was practical for them to do that. That's how the grassroots views things. Practical. You know what I mean? Grassroots into self-defense. But they don't advertise their self-defense. They're too smart to do that. You know what I mean? Bust in on them and see what happens. Mr. Oscar Wright, who I organized with, I was referring to before, in Buffer, Black United Front for Educational Reform, come out of Mississippi. He's 96 years old, still in good shape. But Mr. Wright, we're out there organizing, going door to door. Mr. Wright always carried him a big old pocket knife. When a bulldog came after him, he just flipped it out. And this Negro that was going to let him eat him up started begging him not to kill his dog, called him off. That was Mr. Oscar Wright. You ain't running around advertising that. You know what I mean? That's the grassroots. You hear me? So when we're talking about a philosophy that is grounded in our culture, when we did the discipline shifted state, we were also putting the department in a position of pursuing an aggressive posture of Black nationalism. And that is also what the grassroots is about. They just need to be more conscious of Africa and work on some of those negatives. But basically, that's what the culture is that they've created. And when we get into consumer cooperatives, you're going to see that Black tastes and stuff are largely also culturally driven. And there's some key things about Black taste that come out of African and African-American culture. If you want to be successful in setting up a business, you better understand the psychology of the people that you're setting up a business to gain support from. You better minister to those cultural needs, those psychological needs, and of course, those economic needs. So when we're looking at the connection between philosophy and culture and Black nationalism as a basis for establishing Black businesses, then there are two things that I think are really important to stress that we need to draw from in African culture as well as African American. But it starts with African culture, drawing out of the principles of humanism and communalism. African Americans and Africans around the world are basically a humanistic people. That's our nature. And that is one of the things that makes our people beautiful, even though some of us are departing from it rapidly. The majority of our people, this is second nature. So when we look at humanism, which is central to African culture, the basis for African American culture, one of the bases, we find in African proverbs an expression of humanism. One African proverb says this: "It is the human being who counts. Call on gold, gold does not respond. Call on clothes, clothes do not respond. It is the human being that counts." Real key. real key. It's not the externals, you know, those material things. It's the internals, the human things. Another proverb says, quote, a lack of companionship is worse than poverty. And still another says, one who has family and friends is richer than anyone who has money. So these proverbs are stressing the central importance of the human being as the most precious being on the planet. Most Black mothers teach their children, I've said this before, that people before money. This is a key principle. While some mothers have been corrupted by the drug trade, a whole lot have refused to take money from illicit sources. The greatest pride of a mother is the goodness of her children with all their shortcomings, because we all got our shortcomings. So humanism is key. It's so central to African culture that you couldn't be separated from it in enslavement, contrary to popular opinion. That's why I keep saying, quit saying they dehumanized you. Like hell. Just because you step in the mud don't make you mud. You hear me? And some of us who've fallen into the pit can transcend above it. But the key point is we came out of slavery scarred, but with our humanity intact. African humanism is the basis for African communalism. And this is tied to consumer cooperatives or any kind of cooperative economics. Communalism is the economic philosophy of Africa. And by the way, if the bourgeoisie that's so bankrupt had really internalized communalism, they would have made quite a contribution to the race. In fact, Du Bois, one of the reasons he became so disappointed in the Black middle class is at one point he thought the talented 10th would lead the race. Then he came to the conclusion that they didn't have an interest in anything other than their own material well-being. He said he had thought that this group would take on the communal ethos, because in the United States, the definition of communalism is that the land, air, and water is owned by no one, but is shared by all. So in the United States, where private property prevailed, making you property, then, it's impossible for you to just go on and share somebody's land without owning it. But the fact is the communal ethos carried us through, the sharing ethos, that whatever we had, that came from the humanistic base of our being, that's what carried us through. And so in Africa, communalism was prevalent throughout Africa and still is in the villages in Africa. And because the land, air, and water was owned by no person, including the king, if you had one, and everyone had a right to share in that, they had to put in the work to benefit from it. Therefore, there was no widespread poverty, no homelessness, hunger, unless there was some kind of famine or something, or unemployment. So the ethos, again, of the African, when it came to communalism, was that as you use the land, air, and water, you should leave it in better condition for the next generation than it was in when you received it. And so built into that is this environmental thing that now is such a big deal after the planet is almost knocked out. It was built into the Africans' relationship to the land, to the air, to the water, to nature in general. So if a person wanted to build a house, there were no banks to go to, no mortgage you had to pay for. People worked in collective work teams and put together a house in very short order. you know. Again, communalism. The family took care of their elders, communalism, you know. And the African American still has that impulse. We do more to care for our people than any group, probably other than Native Americans in this country. And you're going to see again how this figures into economic organization. If you're talking about consumer cooperatives, some of the things you got to do to draw on that in building a effective business in our community. And some of our people are doing it. We have consumer cooperatives around the country. I'm just offering some ideas on that. So the African and African American political, cultural, and social philosophy has to be centered on humanism and communalism, because these are principles that, when applied to economic organization, enables us to be able to put food on a person's table, a roof over their head, a job, and money in their pockets, and take them out of just being consumers into being producers. So let's look at how this can work based on the conditions of our people today. Today, with deindustrialization, you've had the weakening of the Black family from 75% two-parent households to 29% now. You need good paying jobs to rebuild families. This is key. And one way is through business development. The job development is another I'm not focusing on today. So we need economic strategies that draw on these humanistic, communal, sharing impulses that come out of our culture. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an important book. All of his books were important. A book called Dusk of Dawn was written in the 30s in the midst of the Depression. This was after the Garvey movement has pretty well been, removed from the scenes. You still had remnants of it, but it no longer had the strength that it had in the 20s. And he's now revisiting his thinking on a lot of things. And I think he was impressed, even though Garvey and him were opponents. He was impressed by Garvey's economic organization. And while Garvey wasn't doing consumer cooperatives, he was doing business development, financed by Blacks. And so Du Bois observed some things that are very important that I think are still true today when it comes to economic organization. In the 1930s, in this book, Dusk of Dawn, he observed that, and this is key, quoting him, "The Black consumer had the decisive voice in industry rather than the all-powerful producer of the past." In other words, Blacks were consumers, and their power in the economy is tied to that fact. That is still the case, even more so today. So when he talked about the Black worker, he said that often the Black worker, as a producer, was an employer for whites. And a lot of those jobs are gone, those producing jobs. But even when they were there, while they were better paying, we weren't running those jobs. So what Du Bois proposed was economic salvation of Blacks along the lines of consumer cooperatives. His reasoning was that the social institutions of the Black community, particularly Black families, were made up almost entirely of consumers. And so therefore, we should build businesses based on that. Now, let's get something straight here, because cooperatives, I think, is the best way to go, because cooperatives allow people to put something in, some little money, whatever, and then get something out and to benefit from their labor proportionate to what they put in and the labor they put in as well, in those cases where they do. But I'm not putting down people who don't have consumer cooperatives, because a lot of blacks, the overwhelming, something like 98% of black businesses are owned by one person. And we need to get out of that. And over 40% of our businesses have been lost through COVID because we didn't get the loans that a lot of other groups did. A lot of businesses have gone down, not just black, but blacks, 40%. It was the same thing in 2008. We lost over 40% of home ownership. And your black president didn't do what he could have done to rescue homeowners. He had money that he didn't use and should have directed more towards it, but he saved the corporations, you know? So when we're looking at it, blacks have taken a heavy hit, and some blacks are surviving basically on their own resources. They got a business employing one person, but that one person, it's feeding his family or her family or both of their families or contributing to it. Or some people, they've got a job and they've got a business, you know? So I'm not putting down these other businesses. I'm simply saying that this is a good way to go when it's coming to rebuilding our communities. And communalism represents an application of communalism to modern day circumstances. So consumer cooperatives are businesses where blacks produce those goods and services administered to the consumer, the black consumer. So consumer cooperatives allow blacks who invest in them to share in the profits. And we know a number of them now. And you also have institutions where you can do banking through cooperatives, and that becomes a basis for financing your businesses. And it's a good way to go for capital development. Now, in 2019, $835 billion of black household money went into consumer spending. $835 billion. Black consumer spending by black households, though, even though that's large, is restricted by the fact that we are oppressed under racism, semi-colonialism, and under a capitalist system where we don't have very much capital due to a lot of reasons. And so as a result, we're restricted in the use of our money because there are three areas that really sap our money: housing, healthcare, and higher education, because families are involved in helping their kids go to college, which they shouldn't have to pay for. As I pointed out, when I went to college, I paid $100 a year because you had a master plan for higher education in California, and New York had the same thing. But as a part of neoliberalism, the banking industry has gotten into this, private enterprise has, and therefore making students go into debt for life to get an education, a higher education. So while there is a capital base for business in the black community, in this case, consumer cooperatives, we have to be honest, there are restraints. And one of them is we're putting a lot of money, the average black person is putting a lot of money into housing, healthcare, and higher education. The cost of black household expenses in these three areas rose. In 1984, it was 38%. To 2019, it was 45%. 45%. And it's got to be worse now with COVID. It is more important to note that black spending follows culture, and that if you're building black businesses in the black community, it's extremely important to understand what the needs are of that community and to really appreciate how culture drives that. Two areas where blacks put a lot of money, more than whites. One is extended families. We put a lot of money into supporting kinsmen and women, aunts, uncles, grandparents, parents, sisters, brothers. We put a lot more money into that because family is the second central principle in our culture: spirit and family, God and mama. You hear me? So understand that. So if your business can aid in that, that's going to be very helpful. And then the other area is student debt. Education is of high importance for us. And so, we're going to put money into offsetting those costs for our children. And then the third area, which has got nothing to do with our culture, is consumer loans. You're talking about, we had, the show on trauma and stress. Debt is a cause of stress. And of course, we're pressed, so you can say, yeah, I don't have the money. But man, the first rule is if you're going to buy something, pay cash for it, unless it's a car or a house. And if you got the money, pay cash for a car and get it used. Get a good deal. You know what I mean? Get a warranty to cover, the incidentals of repair and stuff. Because as soon as you buy a new car, it's lost a good part of its value as soon as it goes off the lot. I don't have any credit cards. None. My credit rating is 850. You hear me? 850. I think that's about 20 points below what's absolutely perfect. I ain't gonna have no stress over that. I mean, if I'm gonna buy something, I'm gonna pay cash for it. Otherwise I don't need it. So that's something. If we just cut down on consumer debt, we not only cut down on stress, we would enable ourselves to put our money in other places. And the key thing is have reserves. This is the key thing. Have reserves. And I know it's hard because given the conditions we're paying usually more for our housing and getting less too often. There's ways to get around that, but that's usually the case. And so, we got less to save, but save, you hear me? I don't care about what I have in my pocket. I care about having some reserves. Some people talk about rainy day funds. Rainy day fund, my butt. You know what I mean? You need reserves so you can do whatever you want to do. That's called the freedom fund. Have your own freedom fund. You know what I mean? Put together some reserves, which means forestalling immediate gratification. You can have some, but you don't need too much. You know what I mean? Now, special demographics of Black consumers are really important. And one of the most important is the Black consumer is younger than the white consumer by 10 years. The average Black consumer is 34 years of age. The average white consumer is 44 years of age. That's extremely important because it's a younger market. That younger market is going to be there longer and going to be able to do more. Now, what you have here is also growth rate in the population. We have now the shift of population from whites to a majority Black, brown, red, and yellow. And this figures in consumer spending habits. And so over 20 years, Black consumption has increased by 5%, while white consumption has increased by 3%. And this is due to declining birth rates. And they're going to decline more. And so when you're building a consumer cooperative or any kind of business, then that's part of what you have to draw from. This younger Black consumer comes out of a culture whose ethos is creativity. And therefore, it is natural for the younger consumer to be wired into smartphones and high tech in general, and of course, brand aware. The young consumer, the Black young consumer, is highly digital. They're more likely to own a smartphone, and they use them 12% more than white Americans. That is the nature of your culture. You're creative by nature. And I really want to say this in terms of an area in which young Black people can really prosper in the economy. That area is computer technology. I'm going to have on this show one of these days one of my former students who is a computer technician. He's also running a series of coffee shops that he's setting up as a business. And he trains young Blacks in the whole gamut of computer technology. When they're finished with his training, they can go directly into the computer industry, which has very few of us. But what's interesting about Blacks in computers, because of the creative nature of African American culture, is that young Blacks tend to be programmers. They tend to be the ones that create programs because creativity is a part of their nervous system. And even young Blacks who have criminal records, they can often get jobs through this skill set. So this is an area. This is also a good area for business, in terms of setting up businesses. And I know some of our people are doing that will train Blacks in computer technology. And all they'll be doing is enhancing their skills because they're going to have young people coming in with a lot of skills already. Another feature of African American culture that drives Black consumer taste is, again, this is tied to humanism. And it's tied to the philosophy of the African American that is highly political. We're a race-conscious people, and it drives our politics. And so one of the things about Black consumers, if you're doing a consumer cooperative, you've got to really appreciate this, is that the Black consumer expects the brand to align with their values, especially support for social causes. Very important. So if you've got a brand that is doing something for Black people, and at the same time is meeting a need for them, they're more likely to support that because that's a part of the culture. You know what I mean? That's extremely important. Kaepernick, the fact that he got these big ads and stuff and a lot of money, promotional stuff, the people in the industry that pushed him knew that they were going to profit from this because he's become a folk hero. And they're associating their brand, their tennis shoes, with a folk hero. Blacks are going to buy that. Yeah, it's opportunistic, but the fact is it's also smart. And if you do the same thing, it can benefit you. When it comes to Black consumer markets, surveys show that Black consumers are prepared to shift about $260 billion, or 30% of their spending, on new products, new businesses, and new services that better meet their needs. This is a huge market to draw from for Blacks who are going into business. Black businesses have a high success rate when they provide an excellent product, an excellent service, and they meet Black cultural needs. An example, and by the way, I want to do a shout out for Barbados. They've just had their ceremony where they have moved out of the Commonwealth status where the Queen was a head of state to a republic status where they have their own president and their prime minister. And I want to compliment the prime minister of Barbados for that. And one of the people she made as a national hero was Rihanna. And what's interesting about Rihanna, she's not only a singer who Jay-Z helped, she's a businesswoman. And she came up with a brand for Black skincare for Black women and women of color. And her brand, check this out. This shows she knows her people. Her brand services or provides skin products for 50 shades of Black and people of color skin tones. 50 shades. Now that's somebody who's really into knowing us, because we definitely are into color consciousness. But guess what? That business is valued at $1 billion. And she puts a lot of money into her people, Barbados, her people. So I really want to take my hat off to Prime Minister Motley, who is one beautiful sister. That is one conscious sister. And they are now setting up, they're going to build a major cultural center designed by the brother who designed the African American Cultural Center in Washington, D.C. He's the best architect in the world. It's really a beautiful design. And it's smart on her part because it's going to bring in tourists, because that's usually one of the things that tourists come to see is various kinds of historical sites. But I just want to say that this sister's just conscious on a whole lot of levels. You hear me? Conscious. Bad. I really like her. Yeah, my wife's from Barbados. But I mean, if she was from another island and wasn't doing good, you wouldn't hear me saying this. I'm saying this because, you know, the sister's culturally grounded. She's hooking Barbados up with Africa to do various kinds of trade things and stuff. And she is educating her people on their African roots, which is heavily Asante, Ghanaian, but also Igbo and others, but heavily Ghanaian. And she's smart, real smart move. And when she's getting criticized for letting the Chinese do something, you know, she's telling the people, you know, on BBC, a sister who did that, she said, hey, are you telling me that we don't know how to manage our own affairs? You know, we can deal with any country in the world we want to. You know what I mean? Just because America's in competition with them, we're supposed to give up our relationships as a sovereign people in a sovereign country. But she's an example of the Black bourgeoisie that identifies with their people's culture and loves her people. And that is generally the case in Barbados. That is one of the middle class groups that serves their people. And I might point out, they're not radical. But if you love your people, that's a radical statement in and of itself. You know what I mean? They ain't into pocketing money. And the people end up being hurt. So I'm really proud of that. And watching their little Passover ceremony earlier this week was really nice to see. And just as I'm having this conversation, the Barbadian Parliament is having the same discussion on cooperatives. How do you use the economic power of people who set up stalls and sell their stuff? How do you give them support? And how do you draw from the economic ingenuity of African people? That's what Africa needs. You know what I mean? And that's what we need here. Black business people need to be able to have sources of money. And by the way, another source for pooling capital that we don't practice, but in the Caribbean it's practiced, it comes directly out of Africa. Some call it the partner system. It is a system where people put money into a pot and it moves around. And so they're able to use that pot to finance something. In the UK, it's used heavily. In the Caribbean, it's used heavily. So uh, that's something we'd have to revise. That's not something we've been practicing. But we need various ways to pool money so our people can get it to set up businesses. So Black consumer cooperatives can build housing. I built the King Garvey housing complex that the people turned into a cooperative, 211 units of low and moderate income housing that still stands. We can repair housing. We can design and manufacture clothing, what a number of our people are doing. You know, our culture is creative. And in fact, with strong backing, Black clothing makers could challenge some of the most beautiful some of the most beautiful creations coming out of places like Italy or France. These are among the most creative Europeans. You know, they have sense of style. Blacks, when it comes to style, baby, I don't know if anybody can beat us. And we have Black stylists. We need more. Making clothing. We gave birth to Matzlinger to, the shoe process. And so we can design and repair shoes, operate restaurants. We have Black communities that are food starved. They don't have grocery stores in them. They don't have supermarkets in them. They don't have restaurants in them. And so good restaurants, that has been a mainstay for Black folks. And our cuisine is top of the line when it's top of the line. And that is an area that we can do more with. And we need grocery stores. We used to have a lot. We need more, and big ones too. We're out of the farming business right now because basically multinationals control farming. And Black farmers have had trouble getting funding. And there's some suits that have just recently been settled for Black farmers, but we have a very small number of Black farmers. We need more. I do a book thing, I'm no big business on it, but we do have a couple of Black book businesses, one, two, three that I know of that are significant. Black Classics Press, Africa World Press, and African Press. And there are probably others where we publish books, sometimes edit them and print them, and in some cases distribute them, as well as magazines. We have Blacks who are doing magazines, and the hip hop community has done a pretty good job with that. Now, I would say that in closing this, the most important area for Black economic development, consumer cooperatives, or just economic development, period, some younger Blacks and older Blacks have appreciated. The two most important areas of the American economy is aeronautics and culture. These are the two that generate the largest amount of capital globally. Generally, as recent as a few years ago, culture ranked higher than aeronautics. A good part of that culture is African American culture. Our culture is a culture of popular choice of this country and the world. It's also the classical culture of popular choice of this country and the world. And that includes the art form. So this is an area that is of greatest importance. Say whatever you want about Jay-Z, he learned a few things about how you maneuver in that realm. Now, of course, that's capitalism, and I'm not a capitalist. I'm not for it. But the point is, consumer cooperatives can do that. Your culture is your coin of the realm. It is your sweet inspiration, but it should also put something on the table. You hear me? We gave birth to Kwanzaa. Maulana Karinga gets credit for that. We should be profiting from Kwanzaa. A lot of people were so purists that they thought it was wrong to do that. Well, why? I mean, what's wrong with that? Various ways. You don't have to charge for admission to Kwanzaa, but you've got Kwanzaa symbols. Some blacks are making them and selling them, but a lot of them are being made and sold by somebody else. You got a lot of ways to do that as a business thing as well. Now, I'm not into that, but I'm saying it's a smart move. It's a move we should make. So in the end, culture is what defines this. So we're the most creative people on the planet. It should be at the source of our economic development and our prosperity. So in conclusion, political, cultural, economic philosophy is at the core of our culture. It is the deepest part and the most beautiful part of our culture. It's what unifies us as a nation within a nation. It is the basis for making things better for our people. Now, I'm not going to sell no story here that consumer cooperatives are going to be the basis for freeing our people. I'm not going to sell any story that you are going to be free just through economic empowerment. You're going to have to free yourself from all those things that tear you down in this system. But we as a people can do a lot better by building on that. Poverty is misery. If we can lift some of the poverty off our people's backs, then that's the reason for doing this. But in the end, it's going to take systemic change of the system before our people are fully free. But this is an important area for us to address. I'm one of the few nationalists that's good at economic development. One of the few. And I'm not that much interested in money. I'm interested in it because it's a necessity, but it isn't what wakes me up. But I am sure not into being broke. Broke is no joke. That's not a good thing. But if you're young and you're broke, it's all right. I was for a good 10 years, and it was deliberate. I'm in a Black freedom movement, man. I wasn't interested in no money. And that was the best part of my life. But the fact of the matter is, it's good to have something in reserve. And we know in this country, housing is really the basis for passing on any wealth for the average person. And we know that that has been blocked for a long time for Black people. And then a lot of the loans we have received have been bad loans, particularly those loans that brought down the 2008 collapse, but even before that. So that the intergenerational wealth that whites have that isn't that much, but is much more than Blacks, is largely based on passing on a house. And so that if you can, that's what you should get. Remember, the sisters, when we were talking the last couple of weeks, their parents gave them some advice. Get a job, get a husband or a wife, and get a house. That's at least the start of it. So that's something, that you need. I mean, what's the point of just renting when now on the East and West Coast, rent is a mortgage? What you're lacking is a down payment. And we should do like the old Southern Blacks did. They come up north and pile 3 and 4 families in a house, and they don't leave until they've got a job and they're on their feet. So you put people on their feet. So we should do that. Instead of all of our kids, when they get property, selling it, sometimes keep it. It depends on what's in your best interest. So home ownership is something so you can pass something on to your children, but teach them something about how to handle money. You know what I mean? So that's it. Who would have thought philosophy could get you into economic development? Isn't that funny? It's got everything to do with it. Why do you think that the only people that support Black businesses are Black people? Did you know that? That's because we're the only ones that have a philosophy to do it. The philosophy of the others is except for the exceptional Black businesses. They'll support those. So if we're the only people we can count on, then we need to do everything we can to mobilize as much support as we can from our people. Hotep. Let's see what we got here. Stephen McKenzie, Dr. Tashaka, what would be your suggestion? What would your suggestion be to someone trying to organize the community? Read my books, The Art of Leadership, Volume 1 and 2. Right now, only Volume 1 is available. If you're going to organize in a community, you have to build an organization. I mean, that's the first thing. And in order to do that, you have to bring together a core group. Those are the people who are going to be the leaders and workers. They're going to keep the group going. And to build a core group, the core is the hardest working, most consistent members in a group. That takes time because when you start to build a group, people will come and go. And so it's a percentage game. You'll get a percentage of people who come and won't go. It takes time. And then you have to shape programs that are geared to the people's needs. You involve people in the shaping of those programs. You have to train people in terms of outreach, how they get into the community and build support. So it's a lot of different things. And a key thing is the sixfold stages to mental freedom. In core, we didn't use it, but after undergoing that awakening, I learned its value. So in Pan-African Peoples Organization, we take people through 8 months, usually of what we call orientation, which was to see where people were in the awakening process. What was their level of consciousness? And then through work, which one of our leaders, Thabiti Mtambuzi, calls immersion, you get people involved in continual work based on the time that they have. And those two lead to transformation. And that's what we'll be taking people through in the sixfold stages to mental freedom. And so then you create a quality of a person in a group much better than if you're just organizing people from the outside. You get into the insides. So there's a lot of stuff to that. And organizing is building institutions. And there's a process to that. We've run an institution called the African Children's Advanced Learning Center, which is our school. It's a 6th to 12th grade school. I set this up in 72. Our members have been running it ever since. So from 72 to now. And that's an ongoing institution. I pointed out before, 90% of our students go to college. 50% get scholarships. We have strong math and science. Some of the teachers are my former students. Others, Brother Robert Woods, who's a master teacher, started in our school for close to 30 years. Language arts is his specialty. And he's got a great attitude thing that the kids love. He's a real nice brother, but no nonsense. So institutions are important. And right now, a lot of us have gone out of the institution building business. We're not doing as much in the way of institutions as we have before. So organizing is a long-term process. There's systems for getting out and reaching people and stuff like that. And I will be doing some stuff on this show on that, but you should get the Art of Leadership Volume 1 that deals with it. And another point, I'll be putting out Volume 2 again. Lao Tzu, Dr. Obutashaka, have you moderators for the chat to keep track of the questions for you. That was something that Brother Ogawa suggested, and we're in the process of figuring that out. He made some suggestions. We have to figure out who can do that. Yeah. And if you're one that would like to help, we could use your help, brother. Let's see. See if this is a question here. Lao Tzu, does the use of the cooperative model require some transformation of the consciousness of the participants? That's a good question. It wouldn't hurt, because anytime you're handling money, then what you really need to do is have a certain kind of consciousness there. And also, when you're setting up a business, you're also looking at trust. And so people have to have that. And so transformation of consciousness would help. Centering the training around business development. But sixfold stages to mental freedom is key to that. And I really want to stress that, because most of our groups in the past didn't use this method, and today don't use this method. They organize individuals. So they get people to read something and feed it back. But there's a process for this transformation that people need to go through. So I would say yes. And I would say that transformation of consciousness and specializing in developing economic skills, but those values are key. Sun Temple, nice compliment. Let's see, Sun Temple. Before Europeans stopped believing that the earth was flat, they did nothing in Europe but fight one another for years, endless wars. So when they stumbled in on the continent of Africa, they started wars. Yeah, when they started in on the continent of Africa, their wars had largely subsided, so that they had more time to concentrate on warring in Africa. And there's some lessons from that. We need to be better at protecting ourselves. African societies needed to be better at technology. We had innovated technology, but we need to be better at that, as well as more unified. We didn't have a concept of Africa then. It was different ethnic groups. Tito district, that black president is another example of bourgeois backwardness. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Tito district, yes, the people in the villages in Africa still have a strong communal culture. Life there is oftentimes better than in the cities. Urban centers are often alienating and break community bonds. That's true. The problem for Africans in the villages is that for too many cases in Africa, the programs that are being provided by the nation state are not working to uplift people in the villages so that they have capital for economic development. And in too many cases, people in the villages who know how to grow food and everything else have not been given the reins of leadership to really dictate what's going on in those villages. And it's, in terms of agricultural development, particularly the profit share, they should be getting a lot more. If you're going to build an economy, the people who do the work need to make a substantial profit, and not the people off in big cities driving Mercedes Benz and stuff. That's real key. Brother Ugawa, what I'm talking about when I talk about economic psychology, I hear Amos Wilson's voice, as that was a major theme of the last 5 years of his life. Yeah. And his book, Black Power, is a real great book. That was a good brother. Too bad we lost him so early. Diz MWP, Political Legacy of Malcolm X, by Dr. Tshaka, reveals how the FBI and New York Police Department had their hands in Malcolm's death. A must read. Yeah, and my book was more a specialty on Malcolm's political thought. And the brother that I had on, that we interviewed on the assassination, Brother Zach Kondo, his book is the best book on the assassination. And if you haven't watched that show, watch it. That's one of our best shows. And because he went into the FBI files. Okay. Brother Ugawa, I purchased the book from the Hoover Institution. I also purchased the 3 Heritage Foundation volume set that fed the Reagan administration. Okay, I haven't. I'll check those out. In fact, send me the titles of those. Sun Temple. There's a conversation going on between Sun Temple and Brother Ugawa. Yes, I love it also. The African people on the continent are beginning to understand the games that America and Europe are playing. Yeah, they understand. It's the problem is being able to have the ability to counter it, particularly at the grassroots level. They understand a lot, but it's also what are these leaders doing to counter it? And they're in a trap too. So understand, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, those are financial traps. Okay, question. You said before that something wasn't just Black or African, it was revolutionary. What does that mean? It seems very important. Something is Black or African. Well, you're dealing with basically the content of African culture, for example. Or Black people in this country say they're Black, and it means that we have a common set of experiences that bind us together as a people. Or someone in Jamaica will say they're Jamaican. They have a common set of experiences that forge a sense of peoplehood. What does revolutionary mean? Revolutionary is on the political level referring to systemic change. It is referring to restructuring and transformation of a society. So if you're talking about revolutionary in the economic system, for example, then you're talking about transforming that system from one where a few make everything and the majority get very little to where there's a even Steven kind of situation. That requires a reconceptualization of how do you organize an economy. And generally, the best way to do that is to draw from those models that have done it before and not just try and reinvent the cart if it's already been invented. So in the case of the economy, the communal model is a model that Africans should spend a lot of time looking at. And that was Du Bois's complaint about the black bourgeoisie. He ended up disappointed in them. And he said that he had thought that they would draw from this communal model. And he found out they were so selfish, they had no interest in anything but themselves. So you have to look at models that have worked. And then, of course, if you're going to tweak them and come up with new stuff, do that. So when King was talking about human rights, and he was saying that the struggle had moved from the right to vote or desegregation to bread and butter issues, he said this phase of the struggle will be costly. And he also said the problem in America is structural. It's the way the economy, the way the educational system, the way this system in general is structured. So he was trying to think through, how do you restructure it? What's the basis for that? And there's long term, there's short term. So that's a difference. It's a lot more than that, but it's about systemic change. It's not just about, let's say, as a scholar, knowing information, but it's about using that information for transformation on different levels. Tito District, I think the recent campaign against critical race theory is also a continuation of the fight you guys had with the Hoover Institute and others to wipe out Africana Black Studies Department. Yes, except that there's no such thing as critical race theory. So they've created a myth. There is at law school, but what's called critical race theory is not being taught in any public schools. But that is manufactured to draw in whites under this thing of we don't want to be criticized for institutional slavery or institutionalized racism. But the fact is, this is a false narrative. This isn't what's happening. But it's believed, by a lot of whites. And then the so-called liberal media picks it up and treats it like it's a two-sided question. Tito District, they're trying to privatize everything, including education, via charter schools, the UPS, United States Post Office, the military, police forces, and on and on. The thing about capitalism is that it needs endless growth. Yeah, the problem is it's a growth in the pocketbook of a few people. This isn't really growing anything in the economy. And in fact, it's also inefficient. W.E.B, Children of the Stars by Divine Lord Seckham, is a new millennium work that referenced Dr. Obafemi and all the great African-centered scholars from Dr. Ben to Professor Cobham either, and even Ra Nefer Amen. Okay. Question, do you have any book titles explaining science from an African philosophical framework? I would think that one of the best is the book, The Star of Deep Beginnings by Dr. Finch. I think that that's an excellent one because what he's done is taken the dynamics of astrophysics and use it to explain African astrophysics, showing that they're the same. But because of his training as a medical doctor and his knowledge of science, he's able to make that something that enables us to understand how these work. Shonda Henderson, from your working group to reconsider and relabel the focus to a multidimensional approach, were there ideas that you personally felt were important to focus on but couldn't be incorporated? Oh, good question. Yeah, overall, the overall thing was that we saw that grounding the discipline in African philosophy would ground us in a whole bunch of principles that are useful in people's daily lives. And of course, at the top is spirit. In terms of teaching African philosophy, it was the use of symbols as a way of teaching, the symbolic method of teaching, which in the Dogon system is called the Dunoso, table of signs, which means knowledge of the universe. So it opens you up to a different framework for teaching. It opens you up for a different methodology or pedagogy of teaching. That's what's been enabled me to come up with an alternative to the Western system of education. It opens you up for a framework for visiting your history so that you get into the minds of the people who are making the history, the values of the people that are making history. So obviously, one of the key values that has been central in this African-centered cultural renaissance has been Ma'at, the notion of harmony, truth, justice, and right order. But what's key about that notion is living it. And so regrounding the discipline in centrally around African philosophy and then connecting it up to everything else is also providing a methodology for being what you learn. You know, we're in the process of learning how to do that. And a number of different people were. And then you're able to bring into the language of the discourse African spiritual systems, so the Yoruba, the Akan, and others, as well as African American. and you know, in reshaping the discipline, we had Allen Temple Church, which is one of our best churches, J. Alfred Smith Jr., which is a church that builds a lot of housing, does a lot of things in the Black community. And so they were giving the input of the African American component. So the other part of this was it was both an African and African American shift. It wasn't just an African shift. And that's what people have often misunderstood when we relabeled it Africana Studies. We weren't throwing out Black studies. We were making sure it wasn't chocolate. It was Black on the outside and the inside, you know, so that was part of the effort. I'm trying to think. The relationship of masculine to feminine, which during this discipline shift, I was in the midst of writing the book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. And this is an issue that affects not just the discipline, but our people as a whole. So what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman in the context of African and African American culture? And these are things that we're still working on. So the book, The Mother Principle, is dealing with what I call twin linealism. And by the way, today at 3 Pacific time at 3, I'll be doing a 45-minute presentation for the Western region of ASCAT, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. The title is Twin Lineal Families, Communities, and Nations. So I was in the process of thinking that one through. And in fact, it was at the time that we did the discipline shift that I was undergoing this transformation where I got this vision that led me to what I call twin lineal families. So it's a shift in terms of how we see our relationship as men and women in families, in communities, and within ourselves. So, yeah, a number of things. Good question, Shonda. Brother Ugawa, can you explain further what whiteitis is? Because you've referenced it before, but not in great detail. Well, you need to go through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. But it's basically what Harold Cruse was describing, in this case for the Black bourgeoisie, but it applies to any Black person who has taken on an identity where they see themselves through someone else's eyes. They don't see their own beauty. It can be as beautiful as can be, but because it's been defined by someone else as not beautiful, seeing it that way. So whiteitis is kind of my funny way of abbreviating getting caught in someone else's mindset, thinking someone else's thoughts, often on remote control without knowing it. That is when it's been most effective. And I experienced that. A lot of our people have experienced that. You know. Let's see if there's any more here. Tito District. Brother Shaka, why do you think those in the petty bourgeoisie class often seem to have the political backwardness as opposed to the working class Black masses? Very good question. Because they've been more thoroughly miseducated. And that miseducation has come through, in Africa, the missionary project, where a group of elite Blacks were trained so that they could end up running Africa along European lines. And here, the Mohawk Conference, that I'm not going into now, I briefly mentioned before, that was held in the 1890s, was where they tried to formally start that process and generally higher miseducation that Carter G. Woodson accurately described as getting you to identify with someone else's culture to the point that you put into voluntary mental servitude. So that group that has gone through the most thorough amount of that miseducation are going to be the most backward. The working class, the grassroots, which were field Blacks who created this culture, are the ones closest to the culture. They've been less brainwashed. Now, there's brainwashing there too. So it depends on a person's experience and consciousness and so forth. But generally, African American culture has a spectrum of consciousness, and at its highest level, it's very high. And its lowest level is very conflicted. And we're seeing some of the reasons. We're examining trauma-causing events, various things. Attitudes that parents have. How positive are they in terms of Black identity, of Black love, of all this stuff? How do they mirror it in their own life? As one of my friends said, it's not just what you say, it's what you do. He says it's not what you say, it's what you do. Your book is your walk, you know? So it's got to do with a lot of that. And there's always going to be contradictions. But the Black grassroots is closer to their Africanity, to their Blackness. And that's why Carter G. Woodson in Miseducation of the Negro said that it's those Blacks who are less educated that have been in the best position to produce the most for the race, meaning built the businesses, built the institutions, and so forth. So, you know, good question. I suspect you already knew the answer to that. You're trying to get clarity for other people. See if there are any more questions here. Yeah, this is Tito District. This is an interesting comment. Bill Maher, Maher and many liberals like him are very problematic. They don't want an economic restructuring of the nation, just vague statement of anti-racial racism, no material changes. True, you know. Brother Gawa, I'll say liberalism is compassionate conservatism, as Bush once tried to rebrand himself. Yeah, some compassion. Tito District, I've heard that same critique about the Black Panther Party. Even some former members have said the same about the adoption of Marxism. Um, yeah, on the one hand, I'd say that the Black Panther Party had it right in terms of the system needed to be changed. Um, and they were drawn from Mao's Little Red Book and stuff like that. And in the beginning, they were dealing with nationalism. Malcolm X was a major influence on them. And then, as they begin to form alliances and coalitions with the white left, especially during the Eldridge Cleaver period, there's more of a move towards the left. The problem with the Panthers is that many of their leaders, especially on the West Coast, didn't have a real understanding of what Marxism was in depth. And the people who they were aligning with had a much better understanding. And so, along with Eldridge Cleaver, who was himself a problem for a lot of reasons, party got put off into some areas that they didn't need to go into. So I think that while I understand their reason for embracing it in that they wanted to bring on the revolution, they didn't really have the depth of knowledge of what it was. Now, some did, particularly on the East Coast. And many of them on the East Coast were much more nationalistic and not that moved by Marxism, as were many in the party, period. So, yeah, I don't think it did them a whole lot of good, but the fact that they took a stand against capitalism, that was right. A stand against imperialism, that was right. Their stand against the war, that was right. And of course, their stand against the police, that was right. I have a lot of respect for them. Just some of that stuff problematic. Tito District, Julius Nyerere was also seen as adopting some Marxist-Leninist tenets, but indigenized, Africanized them with the creation of the Ujamaa villages. Yeah, well, Nyerere drew more from socialism and, the Scandinavian type, but he was primarily grounded in communalism and was adapting that to what he called Ujamaa. That was his way of phrasing that. He had been raised in the villages until he was 12 years old. So he was inculcated with that sense of sharing as a model for how you move. He was attacked heavily. I don't mean physically, but verbally, ideologically, by the African Marxist Leninists inside of Tanzania, who were small in numbers. But they criticized him because he wasn't following their prescription, when in fact he was using the most sharing of systems that Marx would call communism to adapt it to the realities of his people there. And as I pointed out when I discussed this in a previous show, he was frustrated by Africans in his party who had no trust and no love for their people. They actually shut down successful Ujamaa villages, you know. So he was on the right path. I think Nyerere did more things right when it came to nation building than any of the other African leaders. And had he been able to pursue that with support from his own leadership, that could have been successful. Tito District, worker-owned co-ops are a formation that can help raise capital without capitalist labor exploitation. Equal distribution of profits to all workers that produce a value. Yeah, that's the key thing about consumer cooperatives or any kind of cooperatives. It's equal distribution of the wealth that comes from your labor and your investment. Okay, let's see if there's anything on the bottom here. Sun Temple, and Rihanna is a very beautiful woman, Black Power. Right on. My wife's going to agree with that. And I do too. Okay, that looks like it. Sun Temple, thanks for responding to my question. All the best to you. The best to all of you. I've really enjoyed this. And we will post on this page the address for the ASCAT, Association for Classical African Civilization Conference that will be on at 3, and I'll be doing a 45-minute presentation on twinlineal families, communities, and nations. So I want to say, Hotep, till next